The rain struck the windows of the royal ballroom with such ferocity that evening, I thought the glass might shatter under nature's assault. I stood there, watching the torrents cascade down the palace walls, my reflection staring back at me like a ghost from my troubled past. My name is Edmund Blackthorne, Duke of Ravenhall, 29 years of age, and on that autumn night in 1784, I carried a burden that had haunted me for 5 long years. The ballroom behind me buzzed with the chatter of England's finest nobility, gathered to celebrate another of King George's elaborate festivities. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across silk gowns and powdered wigs, while musicians played melodies that should have lifted any man's spirits. But I found no joy in such gatherings anymore, not since that terrible night when I nearly lost my mother forever. You see, 5 years ago, during a journey to our estate in Yorkshire, our carriage had overturned in a storm much like this one. My mother, the Duchess of Ravenhall, lay dying in the mud and rain, her breathing shallow, blood seeping from wounds I was powerless to heal. I was barely 24 then, newly inherited to the dukedom after my father's sudden death, and completely helpless as I watched the woman who raised me slip toward death's door. But then, through that hellish storm, came an angel. A young woman appeared as if summoned by divine intervention, her dress soaked through, her dark hair plastered against her face by the rain. Without hesitation, she knelt beside my mother and began working with skills I had never seen in any lady of noble birth. Her hands moved with precision and knowledge, applying pressure to wounds, checking pulse points, whispering instructions I couldn't understand but somehow trusted completely. She worked for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, her fingers gentle yet sure as she stabilized my mother's condition enough for us to transport her safely to the nearest village. When the physician there examined my mother later, he declared it a miracle that she had survived. The young woman's immediate intervention had quite literally saved her life. But when I turned to thank this mysterious savior, to offer her whatever reward she might desire, she had vanished into the storm as suddenly as she had appeared. No name, no explanation, no way for me to express the debt of gratitude that consumed my very soul. My mother recovered fully, thank God, but I was left with an obsession that had only grown stronger with each passing year. I had searched everywhere for her. I questioned every physician, every healer, every woman of medical knowledge throughout England. I had men investigating every corner of the kingdom, following any lead that might bring me to the woman who had given me back my mother's life. But it was as if she had never existed at all, like some beautiful dream born from desperation and hope. Now, as I watched the rain assault the palace windows, that familiar ache of unfulfilled gratitude pressed against my chest. Around me, couples danced and courtiers whispered gossip, but I remained isolated by my obsession. What kind of man allows such a debt to remain unpaid? What kind of duke cannot locate one woman in his own kingdom? I turned from the window, preparing to make my excuses and leave this celebration early, when the ballroom doors opened with dramatic force. The wind howled through the entrance, extinguishing several candles and causing the ladies nearest the door to shriek in alarm. And there, framed in the doorway like some vision conjured by the storm itself, stood a young woman. She was completely soaked through, her simple dress clinging to her slender frame, her dark hair hanging in wet tendrils around her shoulders. Water dripped steadily from her clothes onto the polished marble floor, creating small puddles that reflected the chandelier light like scattered diamonds. She stood there for a moment, clearly overwhelmed by the grandeur surrounding her, her eyes wide as she took in the magnificent ballroom. The whispers started immediately, of course. I heard Lady Pemberton mutter something about the audacity of appearing at a royal ball in such a state. Lord Hastings wondered aloud how such a person had even gained entrance to the palace. But I found myself transfixed, not by her bedraggled appearance, but by something indefinable about her presence. There was intelligence in her eyes, a quiet strength that seemed untouched by the storm that had battered her. Her posture, despite her obvious discomfort, held a dignity that many of the pampered nobles around me lacked entirely. She possessed an authenticity that stood in stark contrast to the artificial pleasantries and calculated conversations that dominated these social gatherings. As she hesitated in the doorway, clearly debating whether to flee back into the storm or brave the judgment of the assembled aristocracy, I noticed her hands. They were not the soft, pale hands of a lady who spent her days in idle pursuits. These were hands that had seen work, hands that bore the subtle calluses and careful movements of someone skilled in precise tasks. Something stirred deep in my memory, a recognition I couldn't quite place. But before I could examine this feeling further, the crowd's whispers grew louder and more cruel. I watched as her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and I felt a surge of protective anger that surprised me with its intensity. It was then that Lord Reginald Mortimer, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his sense of social superiority, decided to make himself heard above the crowd. He cleared his throat with theatrical authority and announced loudly enough for half the ballroom to hear, "I do believe we have a servant who has lost her way to the kitchens." His voice dripped with contempt as he gestured toward the young woman with his jeweled walking stick. "Perhaps someone should escort this unfortunate creature back to her proper place before she drips rainwater all over His Majesty's floors." The laughter that followed his cruel words made my blood boil. I watched as the young woman's face went pale, her hands clenching at her sides as she endured the public humiliation. But instead of cowering or fleeing as Mortimer clearly expected, she lifted her chin with quiet dignity and met his gaze directly. "I beg your pardon, my lord," she said, her voice clear and educated, carrying none of the subservience he had anticipated. "I am here by invitation, though I admit the storm has left me rather worse for wear than I had intended." Her response only seemed to amuse Mortimer further. He stepped closer, circling her like a predator toying with wounded prey. "By invitation, you say? And whose invitation might that be? Surely no one of consequence would sponsor such an unfortunate presentation." I had heard enough. Without conscious thought, I found myself striding across the ballroom floor, my footsteps echoing in the sudden hush that had fallen over the nearby guests. The crowd parted before me, recognizing my approach and the dangerous expression I knew must be written across my face. "Lord Mortimer," I said, my voice carrying the authority that came with my title and the warning that came with my barely controlled anger. "I believe you owe this lady an apology." Mortimer turned toward me, his expression shifting from cruel amusement to surprised confusion. "Your Grace? Surely you cannot be serious. This person is clearly not of our social standing." "And what, precisely, determines social standing in your estimation?" I asked, stepping between him and the young woman. "The fineness of one's dress? The dryness of one's hair? Or perhaps the content of one's character and the nobility of one's actions?" The young woman behind me gasped softly, and I could feel her surprise at my unexpected defense. Around us, the whispers had transformed from mockery to fascination as the assembled nobles witnessed a duke publicly confronting a lord over a woman none of them recognized. Mortimer's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. "Your Grace, I merely thought to preserve the dignity of this gathering. Surely you can see that this person does not belong among us." "What I see," I replied, my voice growing colder with each word, "is a man so obsessed with appearances that he has forgotten the basic courtesy owed to any lady, regardless of her circumstances. What I see is someone who values the superficial over the substantial, and who embarrasses himself far more than he could ever embarrass another." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon us, the scandal of the moment rippling through the ballroom like waves from a stone thrown into still water. But I found I cared nothing for their opinions or the gossip this would surely generate. I turned toward the young woman, offering her a respectful bow. "My lady, I apologize for Lord Mortimer's inexcusable behavior. Would you do me the honor of allowing me to escort you away from this unpleasantness?" She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes searching my face as if trying to understand my motivations. They were remarkable eyes, I realized, a deep brown that seemed to hold depths of intelligence and compassion I rarely encountered in these social circles. "That is most kind of you, Your Grace," she replied, her voice still steady despite the ordeal she had just endured. "But I would not wish to cause you any further social difficulty on my account." "The only difficulty here," I said, loud enough for Mortimer and his supporters to hear clearly, "would be allowing rudeness to go unchallenged in the presence of a lady." I offered her my arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she accepted it. As we moved away from the crowd, I could feel the heat of curious stares following our progress. The musicians, sensing the need to restore some normalcy to the evening, began playing again, though the conversations around us remained subdued and speculative. "Thank you," she said quietly as we walked toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. "You did not need to defend me, but I am grateful that you did." "Any gentleman would have done the same," I replied, though we both knew that was not true. Most of the men present had stood by silently, content to watch Mortimer's cruelty without intervention. "I think you underestimate the rarity of true gentlemen," she said with a slight smile that transformed her entire face. "I am Cordelia Ashford." The name meant nothing to me, but something about her voice, the cadence of her words, stirred that same strange recognition I had felt when she first entered the ballroom. "Edmund Blackthorne, Duke of Ravenhall, though I suspect my title precedes me in most introductions." "It does indeed, Your Grace." Though I confess I know you more by reputation than by sight. And what reputation would that be? I asked, genuinely curious about what she might have heard. That you are known for your charitable works, particularly your support of medical endeavors and hospitals for the poor. They say you believe strongly in helping those whom society often overlooks. Her knowledge surprised me. Most people of her apparent social standing would know me only as a wealthy duke, if they knew me at all. The fact that she was aware of my philanthropic interests suggested she moved in circles where such things mattered. I do what I can, I said modestly. Though I often feel it is not nearly enough. There is so much suffering in this world that could be alleviated with proper care and knowledge. You speak as someone who has witnessed such suffering firsthand, she observed, and there was something in her tone that made me look at her more carefully. I have indeed, I admitted. And you? You seem to speak with some knowledge of medical matters yourself. A shadow crossed her face, and I sensed I had touched upon something significant. I have some experience in that area, yes. My father was a physician, and I learned much from observing his work. Was? I asked gently, noting her use of the past tense. He passed away 2 years ago, she said simply. But his teachings remain with me. As we continued our conversation, I found myself increasingly intrigued by this remarkable woman. Her intelligence was evident in every response, her compassion clear in how she spoke of helping others. Yet there was something more, something that continued to tug at the edges of my memory like a half-remembered dream. The musician struck up a waltz, and I found myself making a decision that would have shocked me an hour earlier. Miss Ashford, would you honor me with this dance? Her eyes widened in surprise. Your Grace, I fear that would only add to the scandal you have already courted on my behalf. A duke dancing with someone of my station. Someone of your station? I interrupted gently. And what station is that? I see before me an intelligent, well-spoken lady who has shown more grace under pressure than most of the nobility in this room. If that is not worthy of a dance, then I fear I have greatly misunderstood the meaning of worthiness. She hesitated, glancing around at the watching faces that surrounded us. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if she would accept such an unprecedented invitation. Besides, I added with a smile, I believe we could both use the distraction. And I confess, I find your company far more pleasant than anyone else I have encountered this evening. That earned me a genuine laugh, musical and warm. Very well, Your Grace. Though I warn you, my dancing may be as waterlogged as my appearance. As I led her onto the dance floor, I felt the weight of every gaze in the room following our movements. The other dancers seemed to part around us, creating a space that felt both isolating and intimate. When I placed my hand at her waist and took her gloved hand in mine, I was struck again by the strength I felt there, the subtle confidence of someone accustomed to precise work. We began to move in time with the music, and I discovered that she was an excellent dancer despite her modest protestations. Her steps were sure and graceful, her posture elegant despite her earlier ordeal. As we turned and swayed together, the rest of the ballroom seemed to fade into insignificance. You dance beautifully, I told her as we navigated a particularly complex sequence of steps. My father believed that accomplishments should not be limited by one's circumstances, she replied. He insisted I learn everything a proper lady should know, even if I might never have occasion to use such skills in elevated company. He sounds like a wise man. What other accomplishments did he encourage? Music, languages, literature. And of course, his medical knowledge. He said that healing was the noblest profession, regardless of whether it was pursued by man or woman. Something in the way she spoke about healing made my pulse quicken. That is an unusual perspective for a father to take. Most would discourage their daughters from such unconventional pursuits. Perhaps. But my father had seen too much unnecessary suffering to worry about conventional limitations. He taught me that knowledge unused is knowledge wasted, and that helping others should always take precedence over social expectations. As we continued to dance, our conversation flowed with surprising ease. She spoke of her work in London, carefully avoiding specific details but clearly passionate about helping those in need. She mentioned her experience treating various ailments, her knowledge of herbs and medicines, her belief that proper care could save lives that others might consider lost. With each word, that nagging sense of recognition grew stronger. The way she described her approach to medicine, her gentle confidence when speaking of healing, the compassion that colored every reference to helping others, all of it seemed achingly familiar. You mentioned working in London, I said as we moved through another turn. How long have you been there? 5 years now. Since shortly after I completed my education with my father. London offers more opportunities to practice medicine, even for someone in my unique position. 5 years. The same amount of time I had been searching for my mother's mysterious savior. My heart began to race as connections formed in my mind. And before London? Where did you live with your father? We traveled extensively. Father believed in bringing medical care to those who had no access to physicians. We spent time in Yorkshire, in the countryside around various estates. He said that the rural poor often suffered most because they had nowhere to turn for proper treatment. Yorkshire. The very county where my mother's accident had occurred. My hands trembled slightly as I guided her through the next sequence of steps. Forgive me for asking, but do you recall ever treating a carriage accident victim? A duchess who had been severely injured in a storm? Cordelia's steps faltered almost imperceptibly, and her eyes flew to meet mine with sudden understanding. The color drained from her face as she realized what I was asking. You know, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. You know who I am. The music swelled around us as we continued to dance, but I felt as though the world had stopped spinning. 5 years of searching, 5 years of wondering, and here she was in my arms, as if delivered by the very storm that had brought us together before. You saved her life, I said, my voice thick with emotion. You saved my mother's life, and then you disappeared before I could thank you properly. Before I could even learn your name. Tears gathered in her eyes, though she maintained her composure admirably. I never intended. I could not have imagined that you would remember. Remember? Miss Ashford, I have thought of nothing else for 5 years. I have searched every corner of England for you. You gave me back my mother, and I have carried the weight of that unpaid debt every day since. She shook her head gently. There was no debt to be paid. I did what anyone with medical training would have done. What I was trained to do. But that is precisely the point. You were not anyone. You were a young woman who risked her own safety to help a stranger. You stayed in that terrible storm, worked in conditions that would have sent most people fleeing, and you asked for nothing in return. As the waltz drew to a close, I realized that other couples had gradually moved away from us, giving us more space but also isolating us further. The entire ballroom was watching our dance with fascination, clearly sensing the emotional undercurrents between us but unable to understand their source. When the music ended, I bowed formally, but my eyes never left her face. Miss Ashford, there is so much I need to say to you, so much I need to ask. Would you permit me to escort you somewhere more private where we might speak freely? She glanced around nervously at the watching crowd. Your Grace, I fear that further association with me will only damage your reputation. I should not have come tonight. I should leave before I cause you any more difficulty. The only difficulty would be losing you again before I have had the chance to properly express my gratitude, I said firmly. Please. Grant me this opportunity. After 5 years of searching, surely I have earned the right to a conversation. Before she could respond, Lord Mortimer's voice cut through the post-waltz quiet like a blade. Well, well, he announced loudly enough for half the ballroom to hear. It seems our mysterious visitor has quite thoroughly enchanted the Duke of Ravenhall. One wonders what particular talents she possesses to warrant such intensive attention. The implication in his words was unmistakable, and I felt my anger surge again. But this time, before I could respond, something remarkable happened. Instead of shrinking from the attack, Cordelia straightened her shoulders and faced Mortimer directly. My talents, Lord Mortimer, lie in the preservation of human life, she said clearly. I am a trained physician, and I have spent the last 5 years working in London's poorest districts, treating those who cannot afford proper medical care. If that makes me unsuitable for polite society, then I fear polite society's priorities are rather badly misplaced. The collective gasp that rippled through the ballroom was audible above the soft murmur of the orchestra tuning their instruments. A woman physician. In 1784, such a thing was not merely unusual, it was practically scandalous. I watched as faces around us registered shock, disapproval, and in some cases, outright disgust. But I felt only admiration for her courage in speaking such truth to this assembly of privileged nobles who had likely never lifted a finger to help anyone beneath their social station. A physician? Lady Pemberton's voice carried the tone one might use when discovering something particularly unpleasant on the bottom of one's shoe. Surely you jest, young woman. Such a profession is entirely unsuitable for a lady. I assure you, I do not jest, Cordelia replied with quiet dignity. My father trained me thoroughly in the medical arts, and I have been practicing for several years. I have delivered babies, set broken bones, treated fevers, and yes, saved lives that might otherwise have been lost. Lord Mortimer's laugh was harsh and mocking. How perfectly dreadful. And you admit to this unseemly trade in the presence of your betters? Have you no shame whatsoever? I stepped forward, placing myself squarely between Mortimer and Cordelia. The only shame here belongs to those who would condemn the saving of human lives as unseemly. Miss Ashford has accomplished more good in her young life than most of us will achieve in our entire existence. Your Grace, Mortimer said, his voice dripping with false concern, surely you cannot approve of such unwomanly behavior. A lady's place is in the drawing room, not the sick room. This person has clearly overstepped the bounds of proper feminine conduct. The rage that built within me at his words was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Here was a man who had never contributed anything meaningful to society, criticizing a woman who had dedicated her life to healing others. The hypocrisy was staggering. Lord Mortimer, I said, my voice deadly quiet, 5 years ago, this remarkable woman saved my mother's life. While you spend your days gossiping and criticizing others, she has been in the slums of London, treating children who would otherwise die of preventable diseases. If that is unwomanly behavior, then I would suggest that womanliness as you define it is a luxury this world can ill afford. The silence that followed was profound. I could feel Cordelia's surprise at my passionate defense, but I was far from finished. Furthermore, I continued, addressing the assembled crowd as much as Mortimer himself, if any of you find Miss Ashford's profession objectionable, I invite you to remember that when illness strikes your own families, it is precisely such knowledge and skill that you will pray for. The ability to preserve life is a gift from God, not a mark of shame. From somewhere in the crowd, I heard someone begin to applaud slowly. Then another joined in, and another, until a significant portion of the ballroom was showing their appreciation for my words. Not everyone, certainly, but enough to make it clear that Mortimer's cruel perspective was not universally shared. I turned to Cordelia, whose eyes shined with unshed tears of gratitude. Miss Ashford, would you care to take some air? The gardens have covered walkways where we might speak more privately. She nodded gratefully, and I offered her my arm once again. As we made our way toward the garden doors, I heard the conversations resuming behind us, no doubt analyzing every word that had been spoken and speculating about what it all meant. The covered walkway was a blessed relief from the intensity of the ballroom. Rain still pounded against the glass roof above us, but here we could speak without the weight of dozens of judgmental stares. Lanterns provided soft illumination, casting dancing shadows among the potted plants and garden furniture. Thank you, Cordelia said once we were alone. I have never had anyone defend me so publicly, so passionately. Most people, when they learn of my profession, either dismiss me entirely or treat me as some sort of curiosity. Then most people are fools, I replied firmly. What you do requires intelligence, courage, and compassion. Those are qualities to be celebrated, not condemned. She walked to the glass wall, watching the rain cascade down its surface. I should not have come tonight. I knew it was a mistake the moment I arrived, but the invitation was so unexpected, and I thought perhaps. You thought perhaps what? I thought perhaps I might find some way to contribute to society beyond the poverty-stricken neighborhoods where I usually work. There are wealthy patrons here who might support medical charities, hospitals for the poor. I hope to make connections that could help me help others. Her motivations were entirely selfless, focused on serving those in need rather than advancing herself. The contrast between her character and that of most people in attendance tonight could not have been more stark. Tell me about that night, I said softly. 5 years ago, in Yorkshire. What do you remember? She turned from the window, her expression thoughtful. I remember the storm. My father and I were traveling to the next village when we heard the crash. We found your carriage overturned, and your mother. She paused, her voice catching slightly. She was in grave condition. Multiple injuries, significant blood loss, and she was going into shock. I remember feeling so helpless, I admitted. I had never seen my mother hurt, never imagined her mortality so starkly displayed. And then you appeared, and everything changed. You were very young, she said gently. And terrified. That was understandable. I was 24, hardly a boy. But I felt like a child in that moment, watching you work. Your hands were so sure, so gentle. You knew exactly what to do when I knew nothing. She smiled softly at the memory. My father had taught me that in medical emergencies, hesitation can be fatal. You must assess quickly, act decisively, and worry about proprieties later. Your mother needed immediate intervention to stabilize her condition before any transport could be attempted. Why did you leave? The question that had tormented me for 5 years finally found voice. Why didn't you stay so we could thank you properly? Cordelia was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the rain-streaked glass. Because I knew what would happen if I stayed. You would have felt obligated to reward me, to make some grand gesture of gratitude. But that was never why I helped her. But surely you understood that I needed to express my gratitude? That leaving me with such a debt unpaid would torment me? I hoped you would understand that no debt existed, she said, turning to face me. I did what I was trained to do, what my conscience demanded. The reward was seeing your mother survive, knowing that my skills had preserved a life. That was payment enough. I stepped closer to her, drawn by her sincerity and the gentle strength she radiated. Miss Ashford, you may have intended no debt, but one exists nonetheless. Not a financial debt, but something far more profound. You gave me back my mother, yes, but more than that, you showed me what true nobility looks like. It has nothing to do with titles or wealth, and everything to do with service to others. She looked up at me, and in the soft lantern light, I could see the depth of compassion in her eyes that had first drawn me to her all those years ago, even in my moment of panic and fear. You have spent 5 years searching for someone who never expected to be found, she said softly. What did you hope would happen when you found me? I wanted to thank you. I wanted to offer you anything within my power to give. But now that I have found you, I realize I want something else entirely. And what is that? I want to know you. I want to understand what drives someone to dedicate their life to healing others. I want to learn from your example and perhaps find ways to support the work you do. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the ballroom. Lord Mortimer appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with wine and malicious intent. Behind him followed several other nobles, clearly expecting some form of entertainment at our expense. Your Grace, Mortimer called out, his voice carrying the false joviality of a man who believed himself clever. I do hope this consultation is proceeding satisfactorily. Though I wonder if the gardens are the appropriate place for such discussions. One might question the propriety of such private conferences. The implication was clear and insulting. I felt my hands clench into fists at my sides, but before I could respond, Cordelia stepped forward with remarkable composure. Lord Mortimer, if you have concerns about propriety, perhaps you should examine your own behavior. Following private conversations and making insinuations says far more about your character than ours. Her calm dignity in the face of his attack only seemed to inflame his cruelty further. My dear woman, you speak of character? You, who masquerades as a lady while engaging in trades more suited to the lowest classes. You, who apparently believes that a duke should lower himself to associate with someone so far beneath his station. Enough. The word exploded from me with such force that even Mortimer stepped back in surprise. Lord Mortimer, you have insulted Miss Ashford for the last time in my presence. I suggest you return to the ballroom before I forget the courtesy due to a guest in His Majesty's palace. But Mortimer had gone too far to retreat now. Your Grace, surely you can see how this association reflects upon your own reputation. This woman admits to working among the dregs of society, to engaging in activities no true lady would consider. What respectable family would ally themselves with such a person? His words struck at the heart of my worst fears, and I saw Cordelia's face pale as their meaning sank in. The cruel truth was that society would judge any woman I chose to associate with, and her unconventional profession would indeed cause scandal. You are right about one thing, Lord Mortimer, I said quietly, and I felt Cordelia's sharp intake of breath beside me. No respectable family would ally themselves with someone like Miss Ashford. I turned to face her, seeing the hurt and resignation beginning to form in her eyes, but I was far from finished. They would not ally themselves with her because they would not deserve her. They would not be worthy of association with someone who has dedicated her life to serving others, who has saved lives while they concerned themselves with gossip and social climbing. They would not understand the honor of knowing someone with such strength of character and nobility of purpose. The hope that flickered in her eyes gave me courage to continue. "Miss Ashford," I said, taking her hands in mine despite our audience, "5 years ago, you gave me back my mother. Tonight, you have given me something even more precious. You have shown me what true worth looks like, what real nobility means. You have reminded me that a life of privilege is meaningless unless it is used in service of others." I dropped to one knee there in the garden walkway, rain drumming overhead, with Lord Mortimer and his cronies watching in stunned silence. "Cordelia Ashford, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Would you allow me to support your work, to help you build hospitals and train other healers? Would you let me spend my life learning from your example and trying to become worthy of the woman who saved not just my mother's life, but my own understanding of what it means to live with purpose?" The silence that followed was broken only by the rain and Mortimer's audible gasp of shock. Cordelia stared down at me, tears streaming freely down her face. "Edmund," she whispered, "you cannot mean this. The scandal, the social consequences. I have never meant anything more in my life. The only scandal would be allowing you to slip away again. The only social consequence I fear is a life without you in it." She knelt down beside me, taking my face in her hands. "You beautiful, impossible man. Do you truly understand what you are asking? I will never be a conventional duchess. I will continue my medical work, I will insist on supporting causes that society finds unseemly, I will never be content to simply host tea parties and embroider." "Thank God for that," I said, laughing through my own tears. "I do not want a conventional duchess. I want you, exactly as you are. I want us to change the world together." Her kiss was her answer, soft and sweet and full of promise. When we finally broke apart, I realized that our audience had grown. Through the doorway, I could see half the ballroom peering out at us, including several faces that looked distinctly approving. "I believe we have caused quite the sensation," Cordelia murmured against my ear. "Good," I replied, helping her to her feet. "Let them talk. By tomorrow, all of London will know that the Duke of Ravenhall is engaged to marry the most remarkable woman in England." As we walked back toward the ballroom hand in hand, I heard a slow clapping begin. To my amazement, King George himself stood in the doorway, applauding our engagement with obvious approval. "Your Majesty," I said, bowing deeply while Cordelia curtsied beside me. "Your Grace, Miss Ashford," the king said warmly. "I have been following your conversation with great interest. Miss Ashford, I understand you are a physician?" "Yes, Your Majesty," she replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Excellent. We have great need of skilled healers in this kingdom. I should very much like to discuss with you both the possibility of establishing a new hospital for the poor, with royal patronage. It seems to me that a duke and duchess working together for such a cause could accomplish remarkable things." The king's endorsement effectively silenced any remaining opposition to our match. Even Lord Mortimer seemed to deflate in the face of royal approval. As the evening drew to a close, Cordelia and I found ourselves once again by the rain-streaked windows where this extraordinary night had begun. The storm was finally beginning to subside, and breaks in the clouds revealed glimpses of starlight. "A year from now," I said, pulling her close, "we will be married, and you will be the Duchess of Ravenhall. How does that sound to you?" "Terrifying and wonderful," she admitted. "But Edmund, I want you to know that I would have married you if you were a penniless farmer. It is not your title I love, but your heart." "I know," I said, kissing her temple. "Just as I love not your medical skills, impressive though they are, but your compassion, your courage, your unwavering dedication to helping others." 1 year later, on a crisp autumn morning, I stood at the altar of Westminster Abbey watching Cordelia walk toward me in a gown of ivory silk. But more beautiful than any dress was the knowledge that she wore beneath it the same gentle hands that had saved my mother's life, the same generous heart that had dedicated itself to healing others. Our wedding was attended by royalty and commoners alike, by nobles and by the grateful poor whose lives she had touched. King George himself performed the ceremony, and his speech afterward praised not just our union, but Cordelia's groundbreaking work as England's first officially recognized female physician. Today, 5 years after that stormy night at the royal ball, we have built 3 hospitals for the poor, trained dozens of healers, and saved countless lives together. Cordelia practices medicine daily, and I have found my own purpose in supporting her work and using my resources to expand medical care throughout the kingdom. Sometimes, in the evening, we walk through the gardens of Ravenhall Manor, and I remember that night when I thought I was simply attending another tedious social gathering. I had no idea that a storm would bring me the woman who would save not just my mother's life, but my own soul. If you have enjoyed this story of love transcending social barriers, please subscribe to hear more tales of romance and redemption from England's most fascinating historical periods. Until next time, remember that true nobility lies not in the circumstances of our birth, but in how we choose to serve others and love without reservation.